All right, after a less than glorious start last time around, the MMA Prospectus is really and truly back now. I think it's just got to be the effect of a long layoff. It's been what, like 3 weeks since our last show, which is far too long. Maybe even more than that. I hate to think it's been more than that,
It's
but
been a little while. I think the whole break in the UFC schedule, along with stuff going on in our lives, kind of made it happen. But it was nice that there wasn't that much UFC wise going on in between now and then.
it's true. I think we missed a couple Bellator shows and maybe one UFC event. We may not have done a show for the last UFC event, if I remember correctly. But otherwise, you know, it's just been a little hectic. What can I say? I'd love to make excuses, but there are no excuses to be made. Um, anyway, we're here now to talk about UFC Dublin, and thank God we are not in the business of talking about established talent. Otherwise, we'd have a lot less of it to talk about as of this very minute.
Yeah, it's been a little while since we've had a main event get canceled fight week. But yeah, if it's gonna happen, this is not the worst time for it to have happened.
And of course, this is also following the co-main event getting canceled just last week. So,
Yeah.
I
Well, you know
mean,
what? Again, if we're gonna have a card that's ravaged by injuries, I better it be this one than some of the other ones we have coming up.
that's true. And even for the UFC's sake, going to Dublin, they're kind of expected. They're expecting to be able to fill the stadium no matter what they put in there, just because they've got a fan base that they're trying to, they've established really quickly and is still really rabid for MMA.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunately what we've kind of seen is that anytime the UFC has a market they can exploit, they will do so with subpar cards that are otherwise not all that interesting.
They will exploit it till people don't give a shit anymore.
Yeah, so Patty Houlihan's versus Louis Smolka, that's your main event now.
Oh boy.
Two guys that we're not even going to talk about for the purposes of our show because neither one is really a prospect. Smolka, well, okay, no, Smolka we'll talk about. I forgot. He's been fighting a lot less time than I thought. For some reason, I thought he was one of those guys who started fighting when he was like 16.
Yeah, no, he's actually he's a pretty, especially after his last fight, is a pretty intriguing fighter. It's just that this card is not, it was never really about the main event for me.
No.
It is a pretty stacked card of European talent, just not really established, ready to rock talent. Just a lot of up and coming talent.
Yeah, it's very true. So, first and foremost, let's just dive in. And I got to say, Stevie Ray, Michael LeBoot, that fight is killing me. Um, they're both relative prospects, all things considered. Stevie Ray maybe a little less so. He's getting up on the 5 year mark of his career. But they're both guys that I've talked to, that I've scouted, that I've spent a lot of time looking at and watched their careers for a while. So it really kills me to see them fight each other. I'm not excited to see two guys I like face off terribly. I think it's gonna be a fun fight. I think Stevie Ray is probably gonna win it. He's a much more powerful, dynamic athlete. He's a much harder hitter. He's a much more careful wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I hate to see Labu lose.
Yeah, I mean, Ray is, I mean, physical and athletic are kind of his calling cards right now. Um, he's got a pretty nice. He's got nice hands. I like
Hmm.
his, particularly like his right hook, and he's really good in the clinch, and I think that's the key against Laboot because Laboot is at his heart kind of a wrestler grinder type who wants to take you down and wants to really wear you out. And so I think it's the problem that while Ray might not be as technical in the clinch game as Laboot is, he's most definitely the better athlete and the more powerful athlete. And I think that probably wins out in this case. Um, the one X factor to me would be the fact that Laboot is just like a cardio machine and just like
Yeah,
he can keep a pace. And he's scrappy as hell. He's a really good test for he's a good test for a kind of young-ish, like good athletic prospect of like how do you handle a guy who's just not going to go away and a guy who's going to stay on you for an entire fight.
Well, and I think to Ray's credit, and a big reason that I expect him to do pretty well in this fight, he is, um, he's already been in hard fights late. Like when he was coming up through Cage Warriors and Bama and all that, he went 5 rounds with Kurt Warburton. He lost via rear naked choke in round 4 to current M1 champ Ivan Buchinger. So even when even if that's not a win, he's already shown that he's not the kind of fighter that fades in a hurry. He can
Yeah,
keep up a powerful game late in fights. And the big thing that having watched a lot of those old fights, the big thing for him has always just been, because he started as just a totally unskilled, untutored fighter. He didn't have any combat sports background whatsoever. The big thing for him is just always that his game has lacked subtlety. And the better he gets, the more experience he has, the longer he's in the game, the more that his game has started to round out, the more diverse his striking has gotten, the more nuanced his wrestling has become, the better his grappling defense has gotten. All of these things have started to coalesce and make him a much better fighter. And because the athletic ability and the power has always been there. It's just when I talked to him for a while in a big interview I did with him, and he started in MMA when like a friend of his convinced him to come and like train in their friend's shed. And it was like 5 dudes who would just get together in the shed, in somebody's shed in their backyard, and beat the crap out of each other for as long as they could, and that was his MMA training.
yeah, and I think this should be, in terms of a stylistic matchup, a really fun fight,
Hmm.
because Ray is just crazy aggressive on the mat, really dynamic. I think we're gonna see some really fun grappling in this one. And Labout's last match was kind of like that, if I'm remembering it correctly, against Timu.
Hmm.
I think this looks a lot like that, but I think it's one that Labout can't really pull out. I think it's gonna be Ray as the more athletic fighter, and I mean the more experienced fighter. I mean, that's the thing too that I always forget about Ray, is that he's been around and tested a bit more. I think when you pointed out
Yeah.
the fact that he was tested in Bama and in Cage Warriors, that's completely fair, and it was something that kind of slipped my mind. He's been tested more than your average 25-year-old prospect has.
Yeah.
Um, Especially, he's only been fighting for about 5 years, so he is kind of just entering that sweet spot of like your prime that we look for in fighters. But he's fought a lot already,
Yeah.
considering that, and a lot of them have been very quick, get him out of their submission wins. So he hasn't really taken a ton of damage either. So he should still be fairly fresh. And so yeah, I think Ray wins this, and it should be an exciting, fun fight.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what he can do. And I think he's kind of flown under the radar. And even for me, for a long time, he did that as the guy who really may be the best Scottish fighter the
Yeah,
UFC has.
yeah, I think that's entirely possible.
So another great fighter I want to talk about on this card that we're going to see come along or get another chance to perform is Scott Askham. And I know that uh, I don't know. He's been an interesting fighter in that, like, he came in very highly hyped. He got a really top prospect slot on Pat's lists in like 2015 or in 2014 when he published his list. And then he fought Magnus Sedenblad, and just he fought a guy who could take his own game to him and who was really tough, and just a terrible debut. But his last fight against Antonio Dos Santos Jr., where he got a really early knockout, was kind of a wake up call because Askem's always been a fighter who starts with this slow grind, or at least he has been since he started fighting good competition early in his career. He was much more of a quick knockout fighter, but as we've seen, he got to Cage Warriors and Bama and started fighting really other decent fighters, and the knockouts stopped coming. But that Dos Santos fight, that was the kind of the first time we've really seen him bite down early and really take it to someone and hurt them early.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see him come back here against Jotko, who is very much his own young, tough, scrappy inside brawler. It'll be an interesting fight stylistically. Um, Guys that are very similar.
Yeah, I think so. This one has the hallmarks of a fun clinch fight, which sounds a bit like an oxymoron to some, I'm sure, but I think this one will be a very violent fight in close. I think, yeah, I agree with the idea that of a wake up call. I had kind of viewed Scott as kind of like the kind of fighter who has a lot of finishes on the regional circuit, but then it very much seemed like once he started hitting a higher level of competition, the finishes, especially the sudden finishes, stopped happening. Um, I remember the Bama fight; he kind of wore out Max Nunes,
Yeah.
but it wasn't really like this shot out of the blue sort of thing. And the Dos Santos Jr. fight was very much kind of a return to that old form. I think you're right. I think it very much like a mentality, like a headspace going into the cage adjustment, um, may give him a bit more life than I think I initially kind of gave. I assumed he had coming into the UFC.
Yeah, I mean, it because the thing that he really became known for in Bama was being the guy who would grind and control you late into the fight, and the later the fight got, the more he would turn it up, the more active he would get, the more he would open his offense up, and the more dangerous he'd become. And while that sounds really nice and cool, and like, man, especially for like a 5 round fight, that's a great strategy. For a 3 round fight, especially in the UFC, that can be kind of a dangerous game because, like we saw with Sedenblad, he just never really got the chance to actually, like, if you're fighting somebody who's not in worse shape than you and who's not going to break down faster, then you don't get the chance to turn it up late. You don't get the chance to really, to make use of that energy that you're storing. And I think we saw something closer in the Dos Santos fight to a little more willingness to open up early and fight with more raw aggression early. So hopefully we see that against Jotko, because Jotko, I think, I think they both have, they both have losses to Sedenblad, but very similar in that respect. That, I mean, all three of them. Sedenblad's probably he's a better submission hunter than either of them by far, but they're big, grindy middleweights that really like to get in the clinch and pressure.
Yeah.
Uh, otherwise, coming up here, somebody I know you're excited to talk about, Tom Breeze.
Yes, yeah, Tom Breeze, a fighter that I think I underplayed when we were doing our original scouting report. I think we saw the athleticism, but really his first fight in the UFC was his first fight fighting out of TriStar, and wow, his game took such a jump
Yeah.
from. I mean, he was always a really really excellent ground grappler and had sneaky technical wrestling. Um, but his clinch striking, his striking at distance, and I feel like his aggression on the feet just took such a big uptick, and it made such a big overall impact on his game that I'm really bullish on Tom Breeze at this point. I'm really excited to see him get back in the cage. I think he could be one of those fighters that I don't know if he's on the run to like the title picture, but I definitely think he's on the run to becoming ranked and becoming a relevant fighter that people are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I know we overlooked him was that he hadn't, when we started forming our list, he hadn't fought in 2 years.
Oh yes, that's true too.
So that is a very tough. it's hard to judge a prospect at that point when somebody's just not fighting. When they're just not in the cage. How do you how do you judge how good they are?
Hmm.
Essentially, what he'd been before then was a fun fighter and a decent fighter, somebody who was willing to really get in and mix it up and go for all sorts of exciting submissions. But as we've talked about, submission grappling is usually like the last thing you look for in a prospect in terms of will this guy be really successful at a higher level?
Especially like when you're talking about like finishing triangle chokes. It's one of those
Yeah.
things that when it's one of those things that like, oh yeah, like it's fantastic. It's incredibly technical. They're incredibly difficult. You know, I it's not something that happens a lot in high level MMA. I think we were talking over with Patrick Wyman, formerly of of this show on Twitter a couple days ago about the numbers of submissions and the different types of submissions in the UFC in the last year, and there's been one triangle choke in the past year within the or in all of 2014. Um, it's just not something that happens anymore. So when you see a prospect coming up who finishes a lot of fights by submission, even when they're really dynamic and really excellent, in the back of your mind, you kind of start thinking, well, he's going to have something else when he faces the types of fighters who aren't gonna you're not gonna be able to submit in the 2 minute window you get on the ground in high level MMA.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
in his last fight, we saw a fighter that was not reliant on a submission offense.
yeah. I mean, because like, we talked about too. I know on Twitter, just when we had that conversation over seeing all the different numbers for the submissions, I think one of the points that really up to me was what you really saw were it was like how many mistakes does your opponent have to make for you to get a submission, and a triangle choke, like your opponent has to kind of make a lot of mistakes for that to happen. Like, and I'm not saying you can't make a triangle choke happen. Obviously, you totally can, and like any good submission, there are ways that you can force your opponent into it. But if you're talking about general probability, some things are easier to get. Some things require less force. They require your opponent to be. They require less willingness from your opponent to fall into the sub.
The problem with a lot of submissions is there are the mistake submissions that I can snatch up because you made a mistake. There's the transition submissions, and then there are the forced, like methodical submissions.
Yeah.
And the MMA, the high level MMA, you usually don't have time for a forced methodical submission. With a few exceptions, such as the rear naked choke, you can force that on a guy with a fairly low amount of time. But for the most part, you're not going to get those methodical submissions with 2 minutes to work on the ground.
Yeah.
And the UFC guys aren't going to make the mistakes that give you quick submissions. So you're pretty much limited to the occasional methodical submission and then transitional submissions, which are difficult and dynamic and not a sure thing at all, unless you're just a phenomenal grappler.
Yeah. And
So yeah, I mean, like that, I think that accounts for a lot of what you're seeing in terms of like those submission numbers.
yeah, like with a triangle, somebody's got to be hanging out in your guard, not controlling you. Like
Mhm.
that kind of has to be a big part of it.
And yeah, and you have to break them down to put them in a triangle. And then even
Yeah.
once you get the head and arm isolated, actually finishing the triangle is a whole nother process in itself.
Yep.
So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that the triangle has kind of fallen off as a submission. And generally speaking, the kind of the larger point is that I mean, it's not a skill that is going to necessarily carry you to the elite level unless you are one of legitimately the best in the world at it.
Yeah. And what we see out of people like that, when you see guys who really hit a submission over and over again, and we see this every single time, is that they have one or two submissions that they do, and they have 100 ways to get to them. And that's how you have to do it, is that you have to have so many ways of forcing the submission or breaking somebody down that they just that you can cut from one to the other to the other to the other without having to spend a lot of time on any one of them.
Yeah, and it is those guys like it's the guys like a Jacare or like a Uriah Faber or a Damian Maya, who either you have just such a body of work put into that game that the diversity is impossible to stop. Like you're not going to stop if given enough time. Damian Maya will sweep pretty much anyone.
Yeah.
He'll get them off, he'll get your back. But yeah, your point being is that there's just there are too many factors to account for with them. Whereas if you're going up against a guy who's been doing MMA for 4 years and just is lanky and has a good triangle choke, you're going to be able to figure out how to stop that triangle if you've been wrestling your whole life and now you've been fighting MMA for 10 years.
Yeah. And Breeze, to his credit, and this is an interesting thing. I mean, I think there are some people I know I've seen who are like, I think Pendred's going to beat Breeze. And, it's MMA, anything could happen. He certainly could beat Tom Breeze. But the big thing for Breeze, especially as a prospect, is that he's a massive welterweight.
He's big.
And Pendred, his biggest quality and his best quality is that he's bigger than most guys. And Breeze, he's not going to be bigger than Breeze. So at that point, it's
a heck of a lot slower.
Yeah, it's really and even if he wasn't slower, he's just so offensively anemic. Like there's no dangerous part of Cathal Pendred's game. He's not a great ground and pound fighter. He's not a submission threat. He's not a beastly wrestler. He's not a great outside striker. He's not a great inside striker. He's just big and strong, and that's it.
Yeah, I think Breeze is, in my mind, this is a fight Breeze could look very good in, and
yeah.
I think Breeze is going to march to the top, and it's gonna take something a little bit. It's going to take a fighter further along, further up the athletic food chain and further along in their development to stop him than a Cathal Pendred.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Pendred was able to grind out a win. I'm not surprised if Pendred grinds out a win over almost anyone. Being huge and strong and stupid tough allows you for a lot more wiggle room than fans and anybody wants to admit in this sport.
Yeah.
But I do think it's Breeze's fight to lose.
Yeah, I would agree
at that point. So another prospect on this card, and this is a pretty prospect-heavy card still that I want to talk about, is Darren Till. I don't know that his fight with Nicholas Dalby, and Dalby still counts. I shouldn't skip Dalby. We've been talking about him as a prospect for a while. He's been around for a while, but he's just coming up on the cusp of like the end of his prospecthood. He's still very much a guy that you can expect to improve for another couple of years before he hits his prime. He's not yet in his prime.
Yeah. Dalby, in a lot of ways, currently reminds me of Martin Kampmann, like kind of just the well-roundedness and like the way he kind of goes in and he's got a very adaptable game, which is very good. And he's an above-average athlete. And I know back when Pat was all in on this guy back when he was on the show. I think he's going to be a very good fighter. I think he is. He's ready to be fighting a higher level of fighter, and I think Darren Till could give him a challenge. But I think at this point, Dalby is a bit more polished than Till, even though they have they have about the same number of fights. It's my impression that Dalby has just been in there with a higher level of fighter, is more comfortable in there with a higher level of fighter, and is more physically developed than Till. So I think this one is a good fight for Dalby, and then he is going to go on and potentially face some guys with slightly more name value on his way into the division. But I think it's still a very good fight.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because Till, I mean, a big thing, knock that I've had on Till before he got to the UFC, and he's since, I think, proven me a little bit wrong. I'm willing to admit on that. Is that he was a can crusher regionally. Yeah. His level of competition was abominably bad. He was fighting, I think, is it South Brazil or is it North Brazil? That's Damn it, that's an important distinction to make. But let's
Real
see.
quick. He was fighting in. Let's check.
I need to.
Fighting
Yeah.
in South Brazil,
Is
but
it in?
I'm not up on my. I'm
Okay,
not up
he
on
was
identifying
fighting
Brazilian towns by name. So let me pull.
in South Brazil.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was fighting way in the south of Brazil. In Parana, and the competition level down there, I think in general, from what I've heard, is just not very good. Like it, guys fighting down there. That's where the Astra fight team is, and that's what he was a part of.
Mhm.
And almost everyone out of that team is a can crusher. Like they just run up, fight after fight after fight, kind of like Ukraine, where you'll see like not maybe the opponents aren't untrained and they're not totally terrible, but they're like weekend warriors just dabbling in the sport. There's just a wealth of people who are willing to take a random fight on a weekend.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in Brazil. A lot of that.
And Till seems to have benefited from that really heavily in his record. And so when he got to the UFC, the fact that he had a low output, kick heavy style that didn't have a lot of secondary tools didn't I mean it left me with the idea that he's got a lot of room to grow and he can certainly improve a lot, but it didn't leave me especially excited.
Well, and keep in mind in his fight that he won, his UFC debut, he did win, but he pretty clearly lost the first round as he was getting controlled in the clinch. And basically, he won on like a blitz piece of offense where
Yeah.
he hit a counter to a takedown and then just, who was the fighter he just,
Wendell Oliveira.
yeah, he just blitzed Oliveira on the ground with elbows and got a quick finish. But I mean, the fact that he got controlled in the clinch so thoroughly in that fight, Dalby is a really quite a good clinch fighter, and his wrestling looked very much improved. Um, the biggest knock on Dalby I have right now is he didn't look super comfortable in the pocket in his first fight, but I mean
Mm-hmm.
he was fighting a banger in his first match. He was who was that? It was
Eliza Zaleski.
yes, yes,
Eliza Capoeira.
Capoeira, and he was Capoeira can bang, and so the fact that he was uncomfortable in the pocket with Capoeira is very relatable to me. I don't think Till packs the kind of firepower that's going to make Dalby look as uncomfortable there as Capoeira did. So I kind of expect Dalby to win this fight, but Till to have flashes.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I've yet to see the singular striking acumen, like punching acumen out of Till to show that he has it in him to just totally knock somebody out standing with punches. I mean, like I say, his level of competition is just so low
Yeah, well,
that
he's very much an out fighter, and as you said, really likes kicks. I mean, I remember watching his tape, and it was like if you basically saw him throw something besides a straight left or a 1-2, that was pretty rare.
yeah, and I do think he did look better against Oliveira. He certainly has showed some vicious ground and pound, which is I think a great skill. He showed more than anything what he showed and what Oliveira and what we learned too that Oliveira from his brief UFC run really lacks. And it's unfortunate because he was the kind of guy who fought every skilled opponent on the Brazilian regional circuit. Just like a 40 fight veteran, fought every tough dude Brazil had to offer before he got to the UFC. But what Oliveira lacked and what Till has are durability.
Yeah, it's crazy important. It's impossible to quantify.
Yeah.
And yeah, and if you don't got it, you don't got it.
So I think I think there's a lot to be excited for about Till for how young he is and the fact that as he's big enough and tough enough
Yeah.
to be in the UFC, and he's got the kind of some of the base striking tools that he can evolve over time to make that bigness and toughness. Like it's more than Cathal Pendred being big and tough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
You know,
there's some actual there's a bedrock of some other skills there that will come forward to be eclipse his toughness as the primary feature of his game.
yeah.
Um I think the only thing besides his the pocket striking that I'm worried with Dalby's, I still remember Dalby. I still remember him gassing out kind of hard in that, not hard, but gassing out more than your average fighter. But that also might be your UFC debut. You know, your first time
Yeah, I
fighting.
think that's also a function of, at least in Zaleski, just not being prepared for how hard and how powerful and how fast an opponent is.
Yeah,
Like you see that a lot with fighters where there are guys, and Zaleski's one of them, who Zaleski for at least a round is like a top 5 athlete. You think like Abel Trujillo.
yeah,
He's sort of like in that same mold where for a round, this guy is the fastest, most powerful, most dynamic fighter in the sport. And that can take a lot out of an opponent, because for that whole round, you're suddenly just like, you're panicking because it's like, oh shit, I was not at all prepared for the speed and power this guy packs.
yeah.
And then,
I think
as they slow down, you may have already had a big adrenaline dump, but that, Dalby was able to certainly overcome it and weather it. And we've seen him in other long fights in Cage Warriors. We've seen him fight 5 rounds, um, and fight well for 5 rounds.
mhm.
So I don't feel too worried about his cardio. I think that was more a product of Zaleski just being such a physical powerhouse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I don't remember him having problems before then, so I'm perfectly willing to think it was a one time situational problem.
Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, I think he was also fighting in Brazil for that,
Yeah,
and now he's fighting in Europe, which could be a big change too, just in terms of jet lag and
yeah,
prep and all that.
all that good stuff.
So, of course, that brings us to our last prospect on the card, the last guy we want to talk about, which we mentioned at the top, and who is now headliner, Louis Smolka. And Smolka is somebody that he has been a full, I think, I'm going to say, and this is going to sound stupid, but he's been a full 360 revolution for me.
Yeah, I kind of went through a similar thing. I distinctly remember us kind of coming back from that 189 show and just being like, "Whoa, Louis Smoka, huh? Like, how about that guy?"
Yeah, because I remember when he came out of PXC and was their title challenger, I was interested. I was like, oh, this looks like a really interesting prospect. I'm interested to see what he does in the UFC. And then he beat Alptekinaz Kilic, and that actually was probably the first moment where I was a little bit down on him, maybe, just because I was really unsold on Ozkilic as a talent. And then he got beat by Chris Carriasso, which definitely put a lot of the brakes on him for me. And then he had that performance against Richie Vaz, which I kind of gave him a pass on because he came in on a week's notice, where
Yeah,
he just looked out of shape and he didn't look ready to fight. And he
yeah,
won. It was a great come from behind win.
yeah.
Um,
That was the sidekick fight where he,
yep,
yeah,
that was the sidekick fight where he was just getting beat up the whole time, and then he landed that big sidekick head kick knockout
gift
in the
fodder.
3rd round. And then this Siri fight, he came out and suddenly he looked like a fighter I'm really excited about again. He looked fantastic against Neil Siri.
Yeah, it was a display of chain grappling, which was
Yep.
not something that was really evident in his game like post 2013. Like it kind of disappeared. Again, it was one of those guys like you saw a ton of chain grappling, submission grappling on the regional circuit, and then he hit the UFC, and for like a full year, it just disappeared. Just wasn't part of his game at all. And it seems like he's kind of hit another level with it, or something about the way Neil Siri fights just made it much more applicable for him. But
I,
it really showed off a depth of technical skill and an athletic skill and an aggression that I'm not sure we've seen from him in a little while.
yeah, I think it was a combination of the two. I think a big part of it is that his wrestling technique has improved to the point that he can actually get some, he's getting in better on hips. He can get, he's more comfortable hitting takedowns and initiating scrambles.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was also just having a fighter in Siri who uh, really suffers from the classic problems of like wanting to be a well-rounded fighter and was very willing to like try and shoot in on him and try and go for takedowns even when he was in a more comfortable area of the fight.
Yeah.
But then again, like he's had that in Oz Kilic, he's had that in Carriaso, he's had that in Richie Vaz. They're all the same kind of guy. They all have that same tendency of like, I'll strike with you and then I'll shoot in on a takedown and mix it up and try to do everything. So it's hard to say that like that series style would be particularly better suited than anyone else he's faced. I think a big part of it's just as his game has gotten better, his comfort, his ability to find where he's best again, which is really in scrambling submission attempts, has just really clicked.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And I think that Holohan's probably, I mean, he's another one of those fighters, and I expect Holohan to really give him exactly the same opportunities.
Yeah.
He's somebody who is going to come in with a flying knee and then try to shoot a low single and then roll to a leg lock without any particular rhyme or reason to any of it.
Yeah, but I think Holohan's gonna give him a bit more to worry about on the ground than Siri did in terms of technical acumen. I think we're gonna see a little bit more of a match on the ground more than Siri trying to escape the third choke that Houlihan's put him in the minute. I think it's going to be, or that Smoka put him in. I think it's going to be more Smoka and Houlihan trading submission attempts. And I wouldn't be surprised if Smoka decides to stand back up and try to win this fight on the feet and stretches.
Yeah, it could be. I think a big thing though is that Houlihan's less physically dominating than Siri. Like he's less powerful.
Yeah.
So even when he is scrappier and he's a much more aggressive grappler than Siri. So he attacks with much more regularity. But when he's faced similarly, or when he's faced somebody like Chris Coladas, who's also a very physically powerful flyweight, Coladas just kind of smushed him.
Yeah.
So I don't know really quite. I'm not quite sure where Smolka lies on that line yet. He is 5'9", but he's not like a powerhouse fighter.
No.
So it'll be interesting to see how he matches up with Houlihan. I'm actually looking forward to it. It should be a good fight. It's not a headliner. It doesn't make any real sense in that way, except for the desperation of circumstance. But it should be an interesting fight to watch, and hopefully a fun fight to watch.
Yeah.
So really quick, before we dive in, I know we're going to take a look at a couple of bantamweight prospects, but I want to just talk very briefly about Bellator 144, and I know I'm springing this on you apropos of no setup, but just a couple of things I can talk about, and a couple of them that should be easy for you to jump in on too. First of all, Michael Venom Page is fighting.
Yeah. I was aware of that one. Should be exciting stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I talked to him about this fight, and I have to say I'm slowly. I don't know if it's a response to backlash, but I'm definitely like I'm on the anti Michael Venom Page track. I hate the hate.
Yeah, well, I get what you're saying because it's really easy to get pushed into a fighter's camp just by the fact that normally there are going to be a lot of fans. If there's a fighter getting any hype, there's going to be a lot of fans who just immediately react to it and want to see that fighter fail. And especially as you get to know these guys, or especially when you talk to them, it's just like you make a connection with them, and then you want them to succeed on like a personal level, just because it's like, I know this guy, and I want him to be able to make money and be successful and be happy. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
and like I saw somebody the other day, and I can't remember if they were a fan or a media person, but they were saying, Michael Page has been fighting for 3 years now. It's time for him to start facing top welterweight talent. It's just like, go, you know what, go fuck yourself. Like that's not how this sport works. I don't know how many times I have to tell people this, and I think I'm just gonna be ranting about it until the end of time. But if it's less than 6 years, don't expect much. Like there will be a few phenoms that in 3 years should be fighting top talent. Everybody else,
let,
6.
yeah, let them take the time. I agree with you there. I have no problem with the fact that Michael Van Page is not fighting elite talent. He's
Yeah.
not that far into MMA. He has a style that, while entertaining, is still needing to be adapted to MMA on the whole. So he faced his last or his second to last fight. He faced Burrell, and that's a pretty that's a veteran. That's a guy who got a cup of coffee in the UFC. Um, he's been in and out against guys who are decently talented, and that's fine. I have no problem with Michael Van Page, like honing his craft and collecting some paychecks along the way. Um, there's just such a vehement reaction amongst MMA fans to this idea of can crushing, and that it is unacceptable completely, and that our sport doesn't have any of that. And as soon as you look even halfway decent, we should throw you to the effing wolves. And if you swim, you swim, and if you sink, sucks to be you.
Yeah, it's not how combat sports works. It's just not. It's a lesson that boxing has learned the hard way over years, and you see the result of how boxing has learned that lesson. I don't want MMA to go fully into the boxing level of like, give him 8 years of can crushing, and then we'll start throwing some interesting challenges at him. But we have to have at least some reason. And I will say that Ontiveros is not a good fight for Page. He should be further along than that. But to the credit of Bellator and himself, at least, he was supposed to be matched up with Marius Zaromskis for this fight.
Yeah.
And he even had he had two other fighters that were lined up ahead of Ontiveros pull out on him, Zaromskis and somebody else pretty decent and pretty well experienced. And those both would have been acceptable fights. And they didn't happen. Like, they didn't come together. And that sucks. But having talked to him, I mean, it doesn't sound like he's in a position where he wants to be protected or feels like he should be, taking the slow road or anything like that. So, when fans turn around, they're hating on the fighter and they're like, oh, well, why is he ducking legit competition and all that? And you talk to him, it's just like, look, I was booked against this guy, he pulled out, this is my fill-in, I want to be fighting somebody further along, but I gotta fight, I gotta eat, I gotta pay bills, I gotta do this stuff.
Well, I think too with Page, people respond to the persona he puts on in the cage.
Yeah.
And when someone does that, there are people who are going to love it, and then there are people who want to see them get thrown in with someone who can counter it, and so they can't get away with it anymore. And I understand that mentality. And when I was an athlete, I very much had that mentality. When I saw guys doing things that was like not correct, and like, oh, you're just getting away with that, and at some level, someone's going to make you pay for that.
And what I've learned to really love is seeing guys, and what we've seen this over time. Like I say, you use other combat sports as a reference point, and even MMA as a reference point. If a fighter is brought along carefully, what you can end up with somebody who doesn't do things quite the correct way, but who can reach an elite level with a really interesting style because they were brought along carefully and built to the point where they were actually able to finely hone and finely tune that style into something that worked, even though it wasn't traditional, even though it wasn't purely correct.
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't something that, as Joe Rogan loves to say, that you would ever teach somebody to fight like that.
I mean, like that's at the higher levels of combat sports. That's what you get. I mean, you get guys who very much are guys who do things that aren't necessarily correct all the time, and that's okay. Like that's a competitive edge in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I have much more interest in watching, somebody like, um, for like, oh, what's the damn it, the Japanese fighters name, the flyweight who fought for a title.
Oh, Horiguchi.
Sorry, wait.
Horiguchi.
Yeah, Kyoji Horiguchi. Like, I have much more interest in seeing Kyoji Horiguchi get built up and perfect this very, like, arrhythmic, funky, dynamic style he has than seeing, if he had been rushed even earlier, and he was rushed early, but then seeing that get, like, broken down and changed to something more prototypical.
Yeah. If you have something about your game that is uniquely yours and adapted to fit your body and your personal rhythm and how you approach things, it's something that your opponent has to adapt to and that they can't replicate in training. And that's a competitive edge, even if it's not the picture perfect textbook version of that technique.
Yeah, and it makes for more fun and interesting fighters and interesting fights when you can build a variety of styles up to the elite level. When you can build a variety of philosophies up to the elite level, you end up with much more interesting stylistic matchups than just having Ricardo Lamas fight Chad Mendez 20 times over.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, if we're talking about other action that's happening this week outside of the UFC, our number one light heavyweight is going to be fighting on Fight Pass on a Eurasia Fight Nights card, and they still haven't announced an opponent for him.
Well, I'm happy. Just it's Mikhail Mukhnachin. Finally, and frankly, I'm just happy to see him fighting. And I love that the UFC picked up Fight Nights. I honestly, I think that is
great.
just about worth $10 a month on its own.
Yeah, I mean, like that is a lot of really good talent in Dagestan and Russia goes through Fight Nights. It is a fantastic promotion that is definitely worth checking out.
And we should also note on the Bellator card, Isao Kobayashi is making his U.S. debut and his Bellator debut on that card. The longtime Japanese lightweight prospect, now down to featherweight. And I'll be interested to see what he can do, because he apparently has stayed out of the U.S. and out of bigger promotions until he felt like he was ready to compete, essentially.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say, he's a Japanese prospect. Is there any tape on him?
Yeah, there's some tape on him. I don't know how much recent tape there is, but he's definitely one of the better looking Japanese fighters in terms of a aggressive striking style.
Yeah, it's
out there. But
it'll be interesting to see how he does coming over. Though, who do they have him match against? They have him match against Yamaguchi, right?
Yeah, Goiti Yamauchi, which is a hell of a tough stateside debut.
Yeah.
But, like, I mean, Kobayashi's been fighting since 2008. So he's really not quite, I mean, he's only 26, but he's really not quite a prospect anymore. Like I said, he's just, he decided that he wanted to fight the whole developmental part of his career on smaller organizations with, before going up to the a top level. And I don't think that's a bad move, frankly.
No, probably not. So,
and Brandon Halsey's fighting in the main event too. He's probably not going to be a super exciting fight against Rafael Carvalho, a power punching Muay Thai stylist with limited wrestling game, against Halsey, who's probably just going to truck him and lay him prey, ground and pound him to a win. Maybe let's see, probably get a sub actually from Halsey. I would expect Halsey to sub him. But Halsey, he's an interesting, it's interesting how quickly he's kind of skyrocketed for Bellator. Unfortunately for him, he missed weight as a champ, so his belt's been stripped. But he's only been fighting since 2012, and he's a massive, massive middleweight. So he's probably got a future at light heavyweight at some point in the future. Otherwise, let's talk about some bantamweights because we still wanted to get into some more names off our bantamweight scouting report that we put together a while ago and have slowly been doing that, trickling through them. And this time around, it's a couple of guys who are now actually at this point coming off a loss.
Yeah.
Talk about Isaiah Chapman and Tony Tyru.
Both got picked up by World Series of Fighting, correct?
Is Taru in World Series of Fighting too?
No, one. He's in one. Yeah, sorry.
He's in one FC. They've both been picked up by mid-level organizations.
Yeah. And Taru got thrown right into a title fight, did he not?
Yes, with Bibiano Fernandez.
Which was a huge step for him. And honestly, going back and watching his tape, I did not like him as much as I did going back. I downgraded my initial rating of his athleticism. Now, that might be because we've been looking at so many other fighters that I'm just forgetting that bantamweight was kind of already picked over when we started looking at it. So they'd already kind of made their big contribution of elite athletes. So it's quite possible within the division he's still an above average athlete, but looking at him, really kind of an average athlete, but he's a wrestler, grappler type who likes to take you down and then try to submit you. And he's pretty good at it. Toughness is definitely a part of his game because there's one fight, the Corey Tate fight in Cage Warriors, where he struggled a bit with Corey Tate because Corey Tate's bigger, Corey Tate's more athletic, and in the first round, Tate was basically countering everything Taru had to offer, and Taru persevered through, and then in the fourth round, had already kind of taken control of the fight back a bit, and then locked on a rear naked choke to finish him. And it's a fight that if you watch the first round, you really wouldn't be super impressed with Taru. But as the fight went on, he kind of wore down the superior athlete. And he's solid everywhere. He's got a nice trip game in the clinch, and that pretty much sums up his takedown offense, which is, I think, his biggest problem, is that his takedown offense is so trip-based that he needs another way to get people to the ground. But he's a striker that's not going to embarrass himself. He's a solid grappler, though. Bibiano really worked him over on the mat. So overall, though, he's a pretty solid fighter. I think he'll go on to a decent international level career, but maybe not as initially good as I first thought on my first look.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for him, he really got he got an introduction to a top 5 level athlete at exactly the point that he's really sort of trying to find his way into being an elite fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really rude awakening for somebody in his position. He'd been fighting for about 4 years, since 2011. Still a prospect, still developing, but experienced enough to have a head of steam behind him, to be somebody with some, with some hype and some interest and some prospect, some juice to his name. And then getting thrown in against somebody who is top 5 and who has that kind of athleticism that is really, for a lot of fighters in that kind of competition, that's very much sink or swim. When you're fighting somebody who's that athletic, either you can compete on their athletic level or you're going to lose. And that was kind of the Fernandez fight. It was it showed in some technical areas. It showed that his takedown defense isn't nearly, and his wrestling in general isn't nearly up to snuff at an international level.
Yeah, and then his bottom game is not there to get up with the consistency he needed to get up, or to threaten to make a guy back off, and that wasn't there. But I mean, that's a tough fight. That is a huge jump in competition.
It really is. Because Tate is a very good athlete. I don't know that he's top 5, but he's a very good athlete. But he's got an incredibly unstructured game.
Yeah.
He's very willing to give up position for submissions. He's very willing to just throw himself off balance, to throw himself kind of at will at an opponent, to put himself in bad positions, to try and create dynamic offense. And because of that, a very nuts and bolts tough fighter like Taru was able to have a lot of success. I mean, especially because Taru's kind of a sneaky good pocket boxer. He's not a great defensive boxer, but he's really good at hitting little uppercuts and hitting little hooks inside. And he even caught Fernandez with a few of them when Fernandez would try to duck in on him. And he was able to kind of eventually, outwork and outwear and just be more consistent than Tate in doing that. But Fernandez, I mean, that's the kind of loss that it shows you, really lays out. It's like, well, here's all the shit you got to work on because you didn't compete in that fight.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. I do think that Taru, just because he's tough and because he's well-rounded, he's a bit too big. I was gonna say I'd interested to see him at flyweight, but he's too big for that, frankly. He just needs to. He's gonna have to work on his wrestling a lot because if he's gonna try to be a tough, well-rounded fighter, you got to be good everywhere.
You got to be able to dictate where the fight takes place to at least a decent number of fighters you're gonna come across.
Yeah.
So.
That was a tough setback loss. The other fighter we want to talk about is Isaiah Chapman, who also suffered. Who got to World Series of Fighting and did get a title fight, but got thrown in straight with the now champ.
Timur Valiev, right?
Yeah, Timur Valiev, I believe, has since gone on. Just fought Can Crusher Donovan Freelo. Or wait, no, he didn't. Different guy. I'm thinking of wrong person.
Yeah, Timur's another one where it's just another elite prospect, and for Isaiah, it was another big jump. Like, he's been fighting just over 3 years at this point, and he's fighting Timur, who's been fighting about 5 at this point, and is fighting out of Jackson Winklejohn, while Isaiah's fighting out of a small camp in Ohio.
Yeah.
The big things I saw about Chapman that I liked is number one, really good athlete. Comes from a judo background. He was on the national judo team, and then apparently was also doing taekwondo. So he's got a really dynamic kick game. Though his hands aren't really that good, but really in the clinch and on the mat, he's pretty solid. Though he's not really good on the mat when he gets into bad positions. Tough as shit. Needs a lot of polish, but has the bedrock of a pretty solid MMA game.
Yeah, he's definitely a fighter that I think can be a very interesting talent with enough seasoning. Like, this is somebody that if he gets the right coaching and the right management, and they're very careful about how they build him and how they direct him, he could be a very interesting fighter. And this is exactly what I was talking about when I talk about wanting to see a fighter like him carefully built, because you want to see the end result of that style at an elite level. You don't want to see it just ripped apart, broken down, and replaced with a fundamental nuts and bolts MMA wrestle boxing game.
Yeah. So worth mentioning the thing about Chapman, though, is he has actually a pretty long amateur career also.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because you don't usually see that in a lot of MMA fighters. But it is one of those things that with his background, I just think, like you said, I think it comes down to coaching. I think he's going to have to get in with, and like who you're training with in terms of sparring partners and things like that. I think big camp is a must for him.
Yeah, very likely. Somebody, it would be lovely if he could go somewhere like, Sarah Longo or something like that really specializes in taking guys who have a very interesting dynamic game that's built out of a lot of different skills and making that a fluid skill set. Something like what they've done with Sterling, where he's got this kick-heavy wrestling game, and they've really maintained that and tried to keep it and build it and keep it this interesting combination of skills.
Yeah.
Without deconstructing it, and that's what Chapman needs. Because right now, it's interesting. He's got this background in judo and a background in taekwondo, and so he's got this very kick-heavy offense and a very strong sort of clinch wrestling and even wrestling game, offensive wrestling game. But he's almost, especially in his striking, very predictable. Like, he moves in very straight lines. He doesn't come in with a lot of different looks. He's always coming straight at somebody. I think his timing's maybe just a little predictable. And so when he fought Valiev, it was just very much that, like, Valiev was just able to, like, time him and pick him off.
Yeah.
Every time he wanted to try to do anything, Valiev would strike first and would always have him figured out to a T. And that's the kind of thing that it's going to take a lot of time for Chapman to really solidify all those skills into something that works, and it could end up being a very camp dependent rise as he continues on, something where it's just like, do you get good enough coaching to make all of these things coalesce, or do you end up as Sukuju, where it's like he's got this interesting dynamic skill set that
never really
came
together.
Close. Yeah. And so, yeah, but those are a couple more interesting bantamweight fighters we're looking at from the regional scene recently. It was Magomed Babulatov who won the flyweight title for World Series of Fighting. Unfortunately, we do not at the moment have time to run back over more of the previous month's events, so maybe we can do that next week, talk a little bit more as we recap Dublin, get into a little bit more of what's been going on, because, Bulatov is rising up. We've seen some other Bellator events and some other interesting young talent coming up and fighting and putting on good shows that we should get a little more into. But on that note, we're going to close the show for today. You can find me on Twitter at TheZaneSimon. You can find Tom on Twitter at TP_Grant. You can find me on Bloody Elbow and Tom on Bloody Elbow every now and then. And both of us will be right back here next week. And we've got a full cordon of shows coming. I got vivisections. We've got, I think the Care Don't Care came out today. If I Did It. We're going to have Knuckle Up. We'll have a 6th round. We'll have all of this and more of the same next week. Even though there's not a UFC next week again, we'll still have a ton of shows. So everybody stay tuned. Subscribe to MMANation.com and give this video a thumbs up, like, if you enjoyed it. Thanks everyone for watching.